34,000 troops land on an enemy-held island, expecting one of the bloodiest battles of the war. They storm ashore through thick fog, weapons ready, knowing the Japanese defenders fought to the death at Attu just 3 months earlier. But when the fog clears, they find something way more terrifying than 5,000 entrenched enemy soldiers. They find nobody at all, and what happens next kills more Allied soldiers than most actual battles. We're now telling you the horrors of Operation Cottage, Kiska Island, 1943. The battle Canada fought against no enemy, where confusion, fog, and friendly fire turned an abandoned island into a killing ground. So a bit of background first, because we're going into the story of how the Japanese pulled off one of the most successful evacuations in military history, and how Allied intelligence completely missed it, sending thousands of soldiers to fight ghosts. June 7, 1942, 500 Japanese Special Naval Landing Force troops storm ashore on Kiska Island. This is the Aleutian Islands, that chain of volcanic rocks stretching from Alaska toward Japan. Cold, wet, covered in fog probably 300 days a year, and now Japanese territory. The target is a tiny U.S. Navy weather station with 10 American sailors who have no idea war is coming to their isolated posting. The Japanese attack is swift. 2 Americans are killed, 8 are captured and shipped to Japan as prisoners. And just like that, for the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops occupy American soil. You have to remember this was huge at the time. The Japanese also took Attu Island the same day. These were the only American territories occupied by Japan during World War II, and Kiska was less than 3,000 miles from Vancouver. So naturally, the American military immediately starts planning to kick them out. By early 1943, the Japanese garrison on Kiska has grown to over 5,100 men. They've dug in deep concrete bunkers, underground tunnels, anti-aircraft batteries, the whole works. Kiska Harbor is ringed with machine gun nests and artillery positions covering every approach. And here's what matters for what comes next. American and Canadian aircraft are bombing this island daily. Between June and August 1943, Allied planes dropped 1,310 tons of bombs on Kiska. Navy warships shell the place repeatedly, 330 tons of shells onto Japanese positions. The bombardment is intended to soften up defenses before the invasion, and it does, way more than anyone realizes, because by late July something strange starts happening that Allied intelligence completely misses. Some pilots are reporting no signs of Japanese activity on Kiska. Nobody's repairing bomb damage. Anti-aircraft fire that used to be intense has dwindled to almost nothing, and a few pilots even report seeing no movement at all. Intelligence analysts consider 2 possibilities. Either the Japanese evacuated, or they withdrew into the hills to prepare an ambush. And based on what happened at Attu 3 months earlier, commanders conclude the second option is way more likely. Let me tell you about Attu, because it explains everything about what commanders expected at Kiska. May 11, 1943, American forces launch Operation Landcrab, the invasion of Attu Island. The battle turns into one of the most brutal engagements in the Pacific theater. 2,500 Japanese defenders fight for every inch of that volcanic rock, in freezing rain and thick fog. American forces fight in conditions so bad that more soldiers are evacuated for frostbite and exposure than for combat wounds. And then on May 29th, the surviving Japanese launch a final banzai charge. Nearly 500 soldiers charge screaming through American positions in a suicidal attack with bayonets and grenades. The charge temporarily breaks through American lines before being annihilated. When it's over, only 28 Japanese soldiers surrender out of the entire 2,500-man garrison. The rest are dead, killed in combat or by suicide, and American casualties are staggering. 549 Americans killed, over 3,000 wounded or sick. So when Allied commanders start planning for Kiska, they're thinking about Attu. Kiska's garrison is more than twice the size of Attu's, and if they fight with the same fanaticism, casualties will be catastrophic. Estimates for Kiska casualties range from 25 to 30% of the assault force. Commanders are preparing for thousands of dead and wounded, and they're planning the largest joint American-Canadian operation of the war. But here's what nobody knows. The Japanese have already left. After Attu falls in May, Japanese Imperial Headquarters recognizes that Kiska can't be held. The garrison is cut off under constant bombardment. Allies control the sea and air. There's no way to resupply them. Rather than sacrifice another garrison in a suicidal last stand, the Japanese decide to evacuate. An initial attempt using submarines in late June rescues only 820 men. Several submarines are sunk by Allied naval forces, making further submarine evacuations too costly. So Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura is given command of a surface evacuation operation. He assembles 2 light cruisers and 10 destroyers, and the plan depends entirely on speed, stealth, and that infamous Aleutian fog. July 21st, Kimura's flotilla departs Paramushiro in the Kurile Islands, steaming east toward Kiska, maintaining radio silence. On Kiska, the garrison assembles each night at the harbor waiting for rescue. Some soldiers march over 5 miles through darkness from distant positions, only to return before dawn, when no ships appear. This exhausting routine continues for 8 nights as the rescue fleet approaches. And then something extraordinary happens that's honestly almost unbelievable. July 26th, American radar operators detect what they think is a Japanese fleet approaching from the southwest. American destroyers blockading Kiska are ordered to intercept this fleet, and they race off to engage. This becomes known as the Battle of the Pips, named after the radar contacts or pips that triggered the response. American ships fire hundreds of shells at radar contacts, expending massive amounts of ammunition. But there's nothing there. The radar detected a weather phenomenon, not ships. While American destroyers chase ghosts, the real Japanese fleet is approaching from a completely different direction. After the wild goose chase, American ships are sent 105 miles southeast to refuel. This leaves Kiska's northern approaches completely unguarded at exactly the moment the Japanese arrive. July 28th, thick fog blankets the Aleutians like it does most days. Under cover of this fog, Admiral Kimura's flotilla slips through the Allied blockade. At 3:30 in the afternoon on July 29th, Japanese ships drop anchor in Kiska Harbor. The garrison has assembled for the 8th consecutive night, and this time rescue has actually arrived. In just 55 minutes, 5,183 Japanese soldiers board the ships. 55 minutes to evacuate an entire garrison. This is one of the most efficient military evacuations in history. The Japanese leave behind their fortifications, ammunition dumps, equipment, and they booby-trap everything. Buildings rigged with explosives, roads mined, ammunition dumps set to detonate, the works. At 4:25 in the afternoon, Kimura's ships weigh anchor and depart. The flotilla steams back through the fog and escapes to Japan without being detected. The evacuation is complete. Kiska Island is now deserted, and Allied intelligence never detects it. Daily reconnaissance flights see abandoned camps, but assume the Japanese moved into defensive positions. The silence from the island is interpreted as Japanese discipline and preparation for the coming assault. Based on Attu, Allied commanders expect the Japanese to fight with fanatical determination. They'll defend every yard and die rather than surrender. That's what intelligence says. So planning for Operation Cottage proceeds on the assumption that 5,400 Japanese soldiers are waiting in ambush. The Allied invasion force is massive, 34,426 troops. This includes the American 7th Infantry Division, veterans of Attu, who know exactly how brutal this is going to be. The 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment, who are specially trained for this terrain. The Canadian 13th Infantry Brigade with 4,800 men from 4 infantry battalions, and the 1st Special Service Force, Joint American-Canadian Commandos, highly trained volunteers. Naval support includes 3 battleships, 2 cruisers, 19 destroyers. Over 90 transport ships and landing craft will carry the troops to Kiska. The Allied force outnumbers the supposed Japanese garrison more than 6 to 1, but commanders remember Attu. At Attu, Americans had numerical superiority and still suffered 3,800 casualties. So when the Canadian troops board ships in late July, they know what's coming. They've been told repeatedly about Japanese fanaticism, about banzai charges, about defenders who choose death over surrender. Some soldiers write final letters home. Others check their weapons repeatedly. Everyone wonders if they'll survive the next few days. August 13th, the invasion fleet departs Adak, and on the evening of August 14th, they arrive off Kiska. At dawn on August 15th, the naval bombardment begins. Battleships and cruisers pour shells onto suspected Japanese positions for hours. The bombardment devastates the landscape, but there's no return fire from the island, not a single shot. And as morning progresses, thick fog rolls in from the Pacific. Visibility drops to near zero, and at 0800 hours, the first Special Service Force begins landing in rubber boats. They come ashore at multiple points, securing beaches for the main assault waves. The commandos advance cautiously through the fog, weapons ready, expecting machine gun fire any second. They find abandoned Japanese positions but no defenders. The American 7th Infantry Division begins landing on southern beaches, and on August 16th, the Canadian 13th Brigade comes ashore on northern beaches. Landing craft ground onto rocky shores. Ramps drop, Canadian soldiers pour out into the fog. They expect machine gun fire and mortar rounds. Instead, they're met with silence. The Canadians advance inland, following ravines up into volcanic hills. They approach Japanese gun emplacements, cautiously ready for ambush. But the gun positions are unmanned. Machine gun nests are empty. Trenches are abandoned. Despite the fog and tension, all Canadian units reach and surpass their initial objectives without encountering resistance. The only living thing they find is a dog that was left behind, later nicknamed Explosion. But the absence of Japanese defenders doesn't mean the island is safe, not even close. The Japanese left behind a deadly legacy of booby traps and mines everywhere. Buildings rigged with explosives triggered by opening doors, roads mined with buried charges, ammunition dumps booby-trapped to detonate. And in the thick fog shrouding Kiska, Allied troops can barely see 50 feet ahead. The fog creates a nightmare scenario where soldiers cannot distinguish friend from foe. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound could be a Japanese soldier preparing to attack. The tension is unbearable, and on August 16th, disaster strikes. Elements of the 1st Special Service Force have seized their objectives and push toward the main Japanese camp area. They find large stockpiles of abandoned Japanese weapons and ammunition. To lighten their loads, the commandos begin a field firing exercise, shooting off their excess ammo. Gunfire echoes through the fog-shrouded valley, and American troops from the 184th Infantry Regiment hear the firing ahead of them. In the thick fog, they can't see who's shooting, and assuming they're under Japanese attack, the Americans return fire. The 1st Special Service Force, hearing bullets coming toward them, fires back. For several terrifying minutes, American and Canadian troops exchange fire with each other. Finally, officers manage to establish communication and cease fire. Miraculously, nobody is killed or wounded in this particular incident, but it won't be the last. Throughout August 16th and 17th, similar incidents occur across Kiska. Canadian troops advancing through fog spot movement ahead and open fire. They're shooting at American soldiers. American units equally disoriented fire at shadows that turn out to be Canadian patrols. The War Diary of the 13th Infantry Brigade records the confusion. American forces report contact with Japanese riflemen in the fog, and wild shooting takes place. But there are no Japanese riflemen. Allied soldiers are shooting at each other. By August 17th, friendly fire incidents have killed 28 American soldiers and 4 Canadians. Approximately 50 soldiers on each side wounded, and these casualties come without a single Japanese defender being present. On August 18th, another tragedy strikes. The destroyer USS Abner Red is patrolling Kiska Harbor when it strikes a floating mine. The mine broke loose from its moorings and drifted into the ship's path. The explosion tears open the Abner Reed's stern, killing 71 sailors instantly. Another 47 sailors are wounded, and the destroyer is so badly damaged it has to be towed back to port. Meanwhile, Allied troops continue searching Kiska. Patrols sweep through hills, valleys, coastal areas looking for Japanese forces. They find more abandoned positions, more stockpiled supplies, more empty camps. Engineers begin clearing the extensive network of booby traps the Japanese left behind. Over 150 booby trap sites are discovered and neutralized, but not before they kill approximately 4 Allied soldiers. Vehicle accidents on treacherous terrain cause additional casualties. The volcanic soil, when wet, becomes incredibly slippery. Trucks and jeeps slide off roads into ravines. Soldiers suffer from exposure to cold and wet conditions. Trench foot affects hundreds. The longer Allied forces stay on Kiska, the more casualties they suffer despite the absence of any enemy. By August 21st, it's abundantly clear the Japanese are gone. Aerial reconnaissance confirms the island is completely deserted. Patrols have covered every square mile without finding a single Japanese soldier. Intelligence officers examining captured documents discover evidence of the evacuation. On August 24th, Kiska is declared secure. Operation Cottage is over, and the final casualty count is devastating for an operation with no combat. 32 Allied soldiers killed in action, 28 Americans and 4 Canadians, all from friendly fire. 71 sailors dead when the USS Abner Red struck the mine. Approximately 4 soldiers killed by Japanese booby traps and mines. In total, Operation Cottage resulted in at least 92 deaths. Over 221 soldiers wounded from friendly fire, accidents, and booby traps. Some estimates place total casualties as high as 313, including those reported as missing, but probably killed in friendly fire. And here's what you really need to understand about these numbers. More Allied soldiers died capturing an abandoned island than died in many actual battles. The friendly fire casualties alone exceeded American losses at some Pacific Island battles. This wasn't combat. This was confusion, fear, and fog turning allies into enemies. The Canadian 13th Brigade remained on Kiska until December 22, 1943. During those 4 months, sickness was rampant. Cold, wet conditions caused respiratory infections. The isolation and monotony of garrison duty on a barren island affected morale. Soldiers later recalled feeling like one day seemed like another with work going on just the same. The war diary noted that probably not 10% of the force could correctly answer what the date and day was. When the Canadians finally departed Kiska in late December, they left behind a fully developed base. American construction units had built airfields, roads, facilities on the island. In May 1944, the Canadian units embarked for England to join the build-up for D-Day. Many of the same soldiers who landed on Kiska would later fight in Normandy and across northwest Europe. The Winnipeg Grenadiers, who'd been destroyed at Hong Kong and reconstituted for Kiska, would be absorbed into training units. The 1st Special Service Force would go on to fight with distinction in Italy and southern France. For the American military, Operation Cottage became an object lesson in intelligence failures. It's now studied by intelligence officers as an example of how preconceptions override evidence. Allied commanders convinced themselves the Japanese would never evacuate. When pilots reported no activity, commanders assumed it was Japanese deception. The experience at Attu created a mental model of fanatical defenders who'd fight to the death. That mental model prevented commanders from seriously considering the Japanese might have withdrawn. For years after the operation, some sources described it euphemistically as a training exercise. This was partly to avoid embarrassment, but also reflected some truth. Operation Cottage did provide valuable lessons about amphibious operations, cold weather warfare, joint cooperation. But those lessons came at the cost of over 300 casualties. So what can we learn from Operation Cottage? What does this bizarre battle tell us? First, it demonstrates the critical importance of accurate intelligence. The Japanese evacuation of Kiska was one of the most successful deception operations of the Pacific War. Kimura's flotilla slipped through an Allied blockade at exactly the moment American ships were distracted. The evacuation occurred under fog that prevented aerial observation. But Allied intelligence also failed to seriously consider the possibility of evacuation. Intelligence officers saw what they expected to see, not what the evidence suggested. Second, it illustrates the danger of fighting with outdated assumptions. Attu taught Allied commanders that Japanese forces would fight to the last man. That lesson, while true for Attu, blinded commanders to the possibility Japanese strategy might evolve. The Japanese had learned from Attu that suicidal last stands accomplished nothing. Better to preserve forces for battles that could be won. Third, Operation Cottage shows how friendly fire becomes catastrophic in low visibility. Thick Aleutian fog made it impossible for soldiers to identify targets beyond a few dozen feet. Nervous troops expecting fanatical defenders fired at shadows and sounds. In many cases, they were shooting at fellow Allied soldiers. Modern militaries have developed better identification systems to prevent such incidents. But in 1943, the technology didn't exist. Fourth, the operation demonstrates that war inflicts casualties even without combat. Japanese booby traps and mines claimed victims. Vehicle accidents killed and injured soldiers. Exposure to cold and wet caused widespread illness. The destroyer struck a mine, losing 71 sailors. War is dangerous even when nobody's shooting at you. Fifth, Operation Cottage reveals the psychological toll of anticipated combat. Allied soldiers spent weeks preparing for a battle they expected would rival Attu in brutality. They were told to expect 30% casualties. They wrote final letters and said goodbye. That psychological preparation for death and the discovery no enemy was present created a surreal experience. Soldiers felt relief but also confusion and disorientation. That August morning in 1943, 34,000 Allied soldiers prepared to storm Kiska. They expected the fight of their lives against 5,400 Japanese defenders who'd rather die than surrender. The landing craft approached through thick fog. Soldiers checked their weapons one last time. And when they hit the beaches, they found nobody. But nobody didn't mean safe. The Japanese had left behind mines and booby traps, and the fog turned allies into ghosts shooting at ghosts. 32 soldiers died in friendly fire. 71 sailors died when their ship hit a mine. Over 300 Allied casualties without a single enemy soldier on the island. This was Operation Cottage, the battle Canada fought against no enemy. And those 6 words tell you everything about how war can kill, even when there's nobody to fight. Because fog creates confusion, because fear makes enemies out of shadows, and because sometimes the horror of war has nothing to do with the enemy at all.